the Iron Brigade. Images of tall, dark felt hats and blue uniforms fill the imagination of Civil War enthusiasts everywhere. Most popular of these images comes from their intense stand on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, where out of 1,800 men, only 500 men were left to report for roll call. But there is more to the Iron Brigade than just casualties, battles, and heroism. What made these men, teenagers and boys, sign up for a war that would take them 4 years to fight? What motivated them to fight in a war so far from home? How did war impact their view of the world, of their friends and comrades, and their minds? What made them truly iron? And most important, how did the actions of the Iron Brigade impact the Civil War and how we mythologize our heroes? But first, we need to go to the beginning, before they were called Iron, before they were associated with anything related to a famous Civil War unit. The soldiers, the officers, and the commanders of these brigades and regiments will be looked at, and will also be analyzed will be their actions, their battles, their views on slavery, their views on the Confederacy, their views on the war and the Union, ways that we cannot even imagine or fathom today in our society. It was to these men. The Union forever and ever, to them, was the goal. But mostly, also, the compromise of them also consisted of fighting to end the institution of slavery. But it varied depending on each man. The man next to them, whether their brother or nephew or friend was next to them from their hometown. This video series will go through the Iron Brigade's history and will also look at their actions that made them truly iron. The men of the 2nd Wisconsin were from widely scattered Wisconsin communities, including Milwaukee, Madison, Racine, Oshkosh, and La Crosse. The Oshkosh Company showed a certain pedestrian tendency, not unbecoming to the infantry when it adopted the name Oshkosh Volunteers. Not so others of the companies which arrived in Madison identified as the La Crosse Light Guards, the Grant County Grays, and the Wisconsin Rifles. As these companies assembled in Madison, the term of their enlistment was changed from the announcement 3 months to 3 years. The 2nd Wisconsin contained mostly of men from these specific areas in the state, which were ironing locations. Mostly of these men had the gray militia uniform issued by the state of Wisconsin, which was basically the equivalence of how a state militia organization was run. And they specifically would basically train just like every other Wisconsin soldier at Camp Randall. The typical regimental experience: drill, next drill, breakfast, dinner, drill, and another thing, drill. These guys had the typical regimental experience of any regiment so far, but these men were mostly unique. The regiment's second in command, Henry W. Peck of Greene County, also had promise. Appointed to West Point from Ohio in 1851, Peck had not graduated from the academy, but he had at least some professional training. The regiment's field officer corps was filled out by the appointment to the majority of Duncan McDonald, a Milwaukee businessman and former colonel of a state militia organization. As to the enlisted men of the 2nd Wisconsin, an early view was provided by a letter from one of the recruits, written to his hometown newspaper. Describing the off-duty hours of the men at Camp Randall, the soldier wrote that our boys stayed quietly in their quarters, read their testaments, looked at the pictures of their absent loved ones, and tried to keep comfortable. Contemporary newspaper stories do not quite square with this account. Indeed, one Madison daily reported that a group of soldiers had attacked Voigt's brewery after hours, provoking gunfire from the embattled brewer, which the soldiers countered with stones. And obviously this encountered with their training, but eventually they would have to be training to ship off to Washington, D.C. after the first shots at Fire Fort Sumter ran out. They would practice drill, drill, and drill, and drill, and drill again. At the same time, these men were raw recruits, but they were hardened recruits. These had come from lumbering communities in the western parts of the state. And they also were, again, FT volunteers who, some of them have never fired a rifle before in their lives, have now had a chance to prove themselves to fight for the Union for their nation. Now, there have been a couple of command changes going on in around this time, but eventually the men would get their colors. The governor of Wisconsin, Alexander Randall, would give them the colors, issuing them a grandiose speech of glory and aspects to war that, made it look like the fodder than today. But to these men, the Union was everything. It's a thing that Americans in the modern day have never experienced before, how important the Union was to these men. But eventually they would have to be shipped up to Washington, D.C., and they were adored by cheering crowds along the way, along with Pittsburgh, Chicago, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. They went all over the country, and they would be greeted by men, women, child of every age, getting food, getting supplies and gifts. These men essentially were basically like celebrities. But eventually they would have very, very, very high angry crowds of Confederate sympathizers, which beforehand in April there were fires shot at rioters against Union troops. These as a whole would encounter their experience with Rebs and would eventually impact how they viewed the South as a whole through these riotous acts. But eventually they would enter into D.C., looking at different aspects of D.C. as one soldier described as a very, very rundown place. And soldiers would be occupying the Capitol grounds. Soldiers would be occupying the houses and offices of senators and congressmen. The 2nd Wisconsin would be heavily trained in this area. One Wisconsin soldier actually got a glimpse of Abraham Lincoln on the White House lawn. And one of them described it as a very thrilling experience, as was every other Union soldier. And eventually they would be training basically day in, day out, just as they did at Camp Randall. But in July of 1861, they would be getting their new orders. Because remember, D.C. was the main area of target for the Confederates, especially for its main railroad and supply routes. Many of these supply routes would help the Confederacy in turn, and in order to strike a quick and decisive victory in the war that hopefully would end in 3 months, soldiers of the 2nd Wisconsin under General Irvin McDowell would eventually start marching to a place called Manassas Junction, or otherwise known as Bull Run. Now, Irvin McDowell was a very eccentric fellow, according to some of the Wisconsin soldiers. He was more of a commander who was known for what he ate more than what he commanded, but he had an amounts of men with supplies, but again, most of them were raw, green recruits that had never been in a major battle before. And Irvin McDowell would be known as more of a political general per se than a West Point trained cadets like George McClellan, etc. But they would eventually reach Manassas Junction after hours and hours and days of marching. They eventually end up on the nighttime, right around the night before the big main battle was occurring. Now, in this instance, the men are tired, they're sweaty. It's in Virginia, the East Coast. They didn't call it the East Coast back then. They just called it Virginia. Humid weather. But I want you to imagine something where at night the men are just thinking about what's going to happen in the next day. Am I going to survive? What am I going to say to the loved ones back home? What am I going to do? How am I going to fire my weapon? Am I going to conduct myself bravely in front of my comrades, or am I going to retreat like a coward? But the men, like every other soldiers in wartime, would sing. They play music. Again, it's a typical regiment experience of what was occurring at the time, and it really showed how the camaraderie would deepen between the men as music brought them forward, but also talking about loved ones at home and also making vows, or basically making proclamations that, hey, that tomorrow might be my last day on Earth, and I'm not going to make it, and I want you to give my letter to my wife or my mother or my sister or my brother. Every typical soldier experienced this in that night of July 21st. But in the end, the day of the fighting would prove what kind of regiment they were going to be later in the war and even in their lives ahead. The next morning, July 21st, 1861, occurred the First Battle of Bull Run, or, as Manassas was called, the Confederates called it Manassas. The second Wisconsin would be fighting on the flank of this battle, and eventually they'd be caught up in the engagement of it. And so they would be fighting alongside their brothers, fighting from Matthews Hill all the way to Henry House Hill, and essentially fighting in fierce fighting. The second Wisconsin men described men's heads being blown off by cannonballs, or their guts being torn apart by a mini ball, or essentially just savage, intense fighting that these men have never experienced before. These men were new to war. They fought, and they fought splendidly, according to one of their commanders, to Henry Peck. They would fight alongside on the left flank of McDowell's army, fighting on a place called Matthews Hill, holding their positions, fighting counterattack and countering attack, back and forth fighting, essentially, on this part of the line. And they would eventually reach a place called Henry House Hill, where Stonewall Jackson's men would be holding Henry House Hill, which was a major hill of importance for the battle on that day. And so they would march up the hill, again seeing the typical experience of men getting shot, their comrades getting shot, and they would hold their position for as long as they could, suffering horrendous casualties. Men getting shot left and right, legs being blown off, men flying in the air. This is traumatizing stuff to a new regiment that's been handled to fight in this kind of environment. And they kept holding it as long as they could, and as long as they could, and as long as they could. Ammunition sometimes ran out among the 2nd Wisconsin men, and they would fight alongside other regiments like the famous 69th New York, which would be part of the famous Irish Brigade that would test itself very heavily in the years of the war to come. And fierce fighting took place along the line. Counterattack one of these units, such as the 33rd Virginia, would fight for these groups of batteries at the base of the hill. And the Sam Wisconsin men would fight back and forth, taking the batteries, making sure that they were held. And again, they held as long as they could against these men. And unfortunately, they would have to contend against Stonewall Jackson's men, which, in Jackson's famous words, yell like furies, routed across the line. The 2nd Wisconsin men had never heard anything like this. As a result, the Confederates pushed them back down the hill, and they would eventually retreat, hearing the rebel yell as he was coming behind them. Again, these men had no idea what was going on. It was chaotic. Most of these soldiers are walking recruits that were being pushed back, not knowing whether to fight back or not. One account of a general said, "We called them cowards, threatened our heavy revolvers, and threatened to shoot, pulling them out." And these soldiers would eventually have to march along really recent roads where they marched on and retreated back the way they did, experiencing firing all the way back. The wounded would straggle along the road back to D.C. Soldiers described others encouraging them to keep continuing on despite the heavy fire. This was their first battle. The 2nd Wisconsin proved the mettle, but suffered 23% casualties as a result of this fighting. When they returned to D.C., the residents of D.C. were shocked to see their men with arms blown off, eyes gone, moaning in the marching, and essentially just agonizingly traumatic moments that these men would never forget. So what would become of these 2nd Wisconsin men? Remember, they're not in the Iron Brigade yet, but this battle proved their mettle as to who they were going to become. How would they finish the war? How could they finish this rebellion? How would they fight for their friends and their comrades? How would they do it? They proved their mettle, but we will have to wait until the next part, until they become part of the famous Iron Brigade.